My son took the whole family to celebrate his promotion at a restaurant. Everything, except me. My daughter-in-law said, "Don't forget to finish the leftovers in the fridge." I replied, "Okay." Then I quietly packed my bags, wrote a letter, and left it on the table. The next day when they came home and saw what was inside, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." My name is Edward, and I'm 63 years old. For the past 5 years I've been living in what used to be my own home, but somewhere along the way I became nothing more than an unpaid housekeeper. I should have seen it coming. But when you love your family, you make excuses for behavior that you'd never tolerate from strangers. It was a Tuesday evening in March, when everything finally became crystal clear. Albert, my 34-year-old son, burst through the front door with that grin he gets when something good happens at work. His wife, Sadie, followed behind him, already on her phone, probably posting something on social media about their latest achievement. "Dad, guess what?" Albert said, loosening his tie as he walked into the living room where I was reading the newspaper. "I got the promotion, senior project manager, effective immediately." I felt a genuine surge of pride. Despite everything, Albert was still my son, and I wanted him to succeed. I stood up, ready to congratulate him properly, maybe suggest we order dinner from that Italian place he used to love as a kid. "That's wonderful, son. I'm so proud of you," I said, reaching out to shake his hand. Albert grinned and pulled out his phone. "Thanks, Dad. I'm calling everyone right now. We're going to Romano's tonight to celebrate. The whole family's coming." My heart lifted. Romano's was that upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place we used to go for special occasions. When my wife Margaret was still alive, I started thinking about what I'd wear, whether I should shower first, maybe iron my good shirt. That's when Sadie walked over, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor I'd just mopped that morning. She had that look on her face, the one that made my stomach tighten with dread. "Oh, Edward," she said, her voice syrupy sweet in that way that always preceded something cruel. "You don't need to worry about getting ready or anything. This is really just for immediate family." I blinked, not understanding. "I'm sorry." Albert was already dialing his sister Jennifer's number, completely absorbed in his phone call. Sadie smiled, that plastic smile of hers, and continued, "You know, people who are actually part of Albert's success story, his real support system." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there feeling my face flush with embarrassment and confusion. "But I am family. I'm his father." Sadie's smile never wavered. "Of course you are, but let's be realistic here. This is about Albert's career, his future with his real family. You understand?" I wanted to argue, to remind her that I'd paid for Albert's college education, that I'd supported him through his failed startup, that I'd been there for every milestone of his life. But the words stuck in my throat like they always did when Sadie spoke to me like this. Albert finished his call and walked back, over his face glowing with excitement. "Jennifer and Tom are meeting us there at 7. Mike and Lisa 2-0. And Sadie's parents said they'll drive down from Sacramento." "That's great," I managed to say, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. Sadie stepped closer to me, and I caught a whiff of her expensive perfume, the kind that cost more than my monthly medication budget. "Edward, while we're out celebrating, could you do me a tiny favor?" He didn't wait for my answer. "Don't forget to finish eating those leftovers in the refrigerator. I'd hate for them to go bad while we're having our family dinner." The way she said family dinner felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I looked at Albert, waiting for him to say something, to correct his wife, to remind her that I was his father and deserved to be included, but he was already heading upstairs to change clothes, completely oblivious to what had just happened. "The leftover meatloaf should be enough for you," Sadie continued, checking her manicured nails. "And there's some of that canned soup you like in the pantry, much more appropriate for someone your age anyway." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't the first time Sadie had made comments like this, but something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the casual cruelty of it, the way she dismissed me while my son celebrated just 15 feet away. Maybe it was the realization that Albert hadn't even thought to include me in his celebration before that single word, "okay," left my mouth. An entire lifetime seemed to gather behind my teeth and ask why I had trained myself to be so small. I saw Albert at 5 years old standing on a chair beside me while I showed him how to stir pancake batter without spilling flour across the counter. I saw him at 9, feverish and frightened, gripping my thumb while Margaret called the doctor. I saw him at 16, furious because I would not let him drive in the rain after curfew, then crying in the garage because a girl had broken his heart and he did not want his mother to see. I saw the tuition bills, the late shifts, the weekend repairs I took on for neighbors for cash, the fishing trip I cancelled because his laptop died 2 weeks before finals and I bought him a new one instead. All of that history stood in the room with me while Sadie looked at me as if I were an appliance she had inherited and found inconvenient. The worst part was not even that she said it. The worst part was that Albert had become the kind of man who could hear the shape of that cruelty in the air and walk upstairs to change his clothes, because the reservation mattered more than the old man standing in the living room. My face did not change, because age teaches you to hide injury quickly. A child cries when struck. A man swallows An old man smiles if the people striking him depend on his silence to feel decent. I had smiled for years. I had smiled while Sadie corrected the way I sliced onions, smiled while Albert told his friends I liked keeping busy, smiled while my own bedroom became a guest room in the story she told visitors, smiled while Margaret's framed photo disappeared from the mantel and reappeared in the hallway outside the laundry room. But in that moment, the smile did not come. It stayed somewhere below my ribs, dead and useless, and something colder took its place. Okay, I said quietly, because that's what I always said, that's what I'd been saying for 5 years. Sadie's smile brightened. You're such an understanding man, Edward. That's what I've always appreciated about you. You know your place, know my place in my own home. The home I'd bought with my late wife 32 years ago, the home where I'd changed T's diapers and helped him with homework, and taught him to drive in the driveway that I still shoveled every winter. I watched them get ready for their celebration. Albert came downstairs looking sharp in the suit I'd bought him for Christmas. Sadie had changed into a red dress that probably cost more than my social security check. They laughed, Ed, and joked as they gathered their things, completely comfortable with leaving me behind like an old piece of furniture. We'll probably be late, Albert called out as they headed for the door. Don't wait up. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and suddenly the house felt enormous and empty. I stood in the hallway for a long moment. Liz, tending to Albert's car, pull out of the driveway. Through the window, I watched their tail lights disappear down the street, taking them toward a celebration that apparently had no place for me. I walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. There was the leftover meatloaf Sadie had mentioned sitting in a plastic container with my name WR written on it in her careful handwriting, like I was a child who might forget which food was mine, like I was a tenant in my own home who needed labels to remember what I was allowed to eat. That's when it hit me, the full weight of what my life had become. I wasn't Albert's father anymore. I wasn't the head of this household. I was the help. I was the old man who cooked and cleaned and paid bills and kept his mouth shut while the real family lived their lives around me. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals, where we'd helped Albert with his science projects, where we'd planned our dreams for retirement that never came. Now I was sitting there alone, holding a container of leftovers, while my son celebrated his success with everyone except me. For the first time in 5 years, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my anger, and as I sat there in that quiet kitchen, I made a decision that would change everything. Those 5 years had not been one long cruelty. If they had been, I might have left sooner. What keeps a person trapped is the unevenness, the tiny kindnesses scattered just often enough to confuse the map. Albert would bring me coffee on a Saturday and ask if my knee was bothering me, and for the rest of the week, I would use that one gesture to excuse every dismissal. Sadie would praise my pot roast in front of guests, calling it Edward's specialty, and I would pretend not to hear the ownership in her voice, as if my labor had become a charming feature of their household. On Father's Day, she bought me a cardigan 2 sizes too large and posted a photograph online with the caption, "Grateful for the father figure who helps keep our home running." People commented with hearts and little prayer hands, and I sat at the table looking at that phrase, father figure, wondering how a man becomes symbolic while still alive. The boys in the neighborhood, children who had once called me Mr. Holloway and asked to borrow tools, began asking Sadie whether they should leave packages with her or with the older gentleman who lived downstairs. Downstairs, as if I rented a corner from them. Each shift was small enough to survive and large enough to change the ground. Sadie never demanded everything at once. She was too intelligent for that. She waited until I volunteered one task, then treated it as permanent. She waited until I paid one emergency bill, then spoke of shared responsibilities. She waited until I accepted one correction, then built a vocabulary around my incompetence. By the time she typed the cleaning schedule and placed it on the counter with a magnet shaped like a lemon, I had already been trained not to laugh in her face. I looked at the columns: Monday floors, Tuesday bathrooms, Wednesday laundry, Thursday groceries, Friday meal prep, Saturday deep clean, Sunday rest if needed. And I actually said thank you. That memory shames me more than the schedule itself. I thanked the woman who assigned chores to the owner of the house, because I wanted one more week without conflict. Sitting alone in that kitchen with their celebration laughter still echoing in my ears, my mind drifted back to how it all began. It wasn't sudden, this erosion of my place in my own family. It happened so gradually that I barely noticed, until I was already invisible. Margaret died 6 years ago after a brutal fight with cancer that lasted 18 months. During those final weeks, Albert was finishing his master's degree and could only visit on weekends. I understood. I held her hand through the chemo treatments, drove her to every appointment, and held her when she cried from the pain when she died on that grey November morning. I thought the worst was behind me. Albert met Sadie 2 months after his mother's funeral. He brought her to Sunday dinner, and I remember trying so hard to like her. She was polite enough, asking about Margaret's garden and complimenting the roast I'd learned to cook from watching my wife for 37 years. But there was something in her eyes when she looked around our modest home, a calculating quality thought. Tea made me uncomfortable. Your father seems very self-sufficient, I overheard her tell Albert one evening, when they thought I was upstairs. It's nice that he can take care of himself. That should have been my first warning. The changes started small. Albert began cancelling our traditional Saturday morning breakfasts, the ones we'd shared since he was 12 years old. Sadie and I have plans became his standard excuse. Then it was missing our monthly fishing trips, something we'd done together, since he could hold a rod. When they got engaged, after dating for only 8 months, Sadie suggested they move in with me temporarily to save money for their wedding. I agreed immediately. The house fee lt so empty without Margaret, and I thought having them there would help fill the silence. That was my second mistake. At first things seemed normal enough. I cooked dinner most nights because I enjoyed it. And because Sadie claimed she was still learning, Albert would praise my meals and tell Sadie she was lucky to have such a good cook around. But gradually the praise stopped, and the expectations grew. Edward makes the best pot roast became Edward. We're having the Johnsons over for dinner Saturday. You'll handle the cooking right. Dad's really good at keeping house. Became the bathroom needs cleaning. Edward. I left the supplies on the counter. I told myself it was temporary. They were young and busy with their careers. I was retired and had the time. I was helping family. The way Margaret would have wanted me to the wedding was lovely, though I barely felt like more than a guest. Sadie had very specific ideas about everything, and my opinions weren't solicited. I paid for the flowers, a $30 expense that wiped out most of my savings from that month because Albert mentioned they were struggling with costs. Just until we get on our feet, Dad, he'd said. You understand, after the wedding, I expected them to move out. They talked about finding their own place, maybe a small apartment downtown. But every time I brought it up, there was a new excuse. Sadie was starting a new job and needed to save money. Albert was waiting for a promotion. Housing market was terrible. Months turned into years, and slowly I stopped being the homeowner and became the live-in help. It happened so gradually that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it shifted. Maybe it was when Sadie started leaving me grocery lists with specific instructions about what to buy and how much to spend. Maybe it was when Albert stopped asking if I wanted to join them for dinner out and started assuming I'd prefer to stay home. Or maybe it was the day Sadie handed me a cleaning schedule she'd typed up on her computer, complete with daily tasks and weekly deep cleaning requirements. I thought, this might help you stay organized, she'd said with that bright smile. You know how important it is to maintain standards in my own home. As if I hadn't been maintaining this house for over 30 years. I started noticing other things too, how they'd have long conversations about their friends, their work, their plans, but the moment I tried to contribute, the conversation would shift or die entirely. How Sadie would rearrange furniture or throw away my belongings without asking, claiming she was updating the decor. How Albert stopped coming to me for advice and started treating me like an aging relative who needed to be managed rather than respected. The worst part was how my own son seemed to forget who I was. Albert began introducing me to new people as my father, who lives with us, instead of my father in whose home we live. The distinction might seem small, but it changed everything about how people saw me and how I saw myself. I remember the day I realized I'd become completely invisible. Albert's college friend and Michael came to visit, and they spent the entire evening discussing their careers, their investments, their futures. I sat in my own living room, listening to them talk about me as if I wasn't there. It's great that your dad can help around the house, Michael said. My parents are getting older too, and I worry about how they'll manage. Why can't take care of themselves anymore? Albert nodded sympathetically. Yeah, it works out well. He keeps busy with the cooking and cleaning, and we help with the bills and maintenance. It's a good arrangement for everyone, a good arrangement. As if my paying the mortgage and utilities while cooking their meals and cleaning their messes was our charity on their part. But I said nothing. I'd learned that speaking up only resulted in hurt feelings and accusations, that I was being difficult. It was easier to stay quiet, to accept whatever scraps of respect they were willing to give me. The money situation was perhaps the most painful part. I'd always been good with finances, careful and responsible. After Margaret died, I'd hoped to travel a little, maybe visit my sister in Oregon, or take that train trip across the country we'd always talked about. Instead, I found myself subsidizing my son's lifestyle while being treated like hired help in my own home. When Albert's car broke down, I paid the $2,000 repair bill without being asked for reimbursement. When Sadie wanted new furniture for the living room, I somehow ended up financing the $0 sectional that I wasn't even allowed to sit on when they had company. It's an investment in the family home. Sadie would say when these expenses came up, you understand the value of maintaining property values. The family home, my home, the home that was still in my name, that I still paid taxes on, that I still maintained and insured and worried about, but somehow in their minds it had become communal property, where I was the lowest ranking member. Tonight's exclusion from Albert's promotion celebration wasn't an aberration, it was the logical conclusion of 5 years of gradual erasure. I'd been edited out of my own family, reduced to a supporting character in my own life story. As I sat there with that container of leftover meatloaf, I realized something that both terrified and liberated me. I had choices. I didn't have to accept this. I didn't have to smile and say okay when my daughter-in-law treated me like the help. I didn't have to pretend that being excluded from my own son's celebration was acceptable. For the first time in 5 years, I allowed myself to imagine what my life could look like if I stopped being so understanding, so accommodating, so grateful for whatever crumbs of affection they threw my way. And as that thought took hold, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. There had been a Saturday morning 8 months before the promotion dinner, when the old shape of my life gave one last weak pulse before Sadie pressed her thumb over it. Albert and I had eaten breakfast together on Saturdays since he was 12 years old. First, because Margaret worked double shifts at the hospital, and I needed a way to keep him talking during the years when boys begin closing doors. Later, because the habit survived into adulthood the way good habits sometimes do when nobody is trying to kill them. We would go to Miller's Diner at 8. Sit in the booth near the window, order eggs, toast, coffee for me, orange juice for him even after he was old enough for coffee, and talk about nothing important until something important slipped out sideways. After Margaret died, those breakfasts became the only place where Albert still seemed like my son, instead of a man managed by a calendar I did not control. Then Sadie started needing him on Saturdays. At first it was brunch with friends, then errands, then couples yoga, then open houses. They claimed they were browsing for inspiration, though they never had money to move. That particular Saturday, I had put on my jacket and was standing near the front door when Sadie came downstairs in leggings and one of those quilted vests women wear when they want exercise to look expensive. Albert was behind her, rubbing sleep from his eyes, already apologizing with his posture. Sadie looked at my jacket and made her face gentle. "Edward, did Albert forget to tell you? We have plans this morning." I looked at my son. He looked at the floor. I said, "We always have breakfast on the first Saturday." She tilted her head, a small movement filled with pity. "Traditions are sweet," she said, "but marriages need traditions too." Then she touched his arm and smiled up at him, and he gave me that helpless look I had slowly learned to hate. Not because he was trapped, but because he wanted me to release him from the discomfort of choosing. I said, "Of course, maybe next week." There was no next week. There almost never is after the first time someone successfully moves the boundary. There was the fishing gear too, and I still think about it more often than I should. In the garage on the left wall, I kept 2 rods in metal brackets, mine and Albert's. His first real rod had been a birthday present when he was 10. He practiced casting in the backyard until the lure caught in Margaret's roses, and she came outside with pruning shears, laughing while he apologized as if he had damaged a national monument. Every spring we went to the lake before sunrise, not because the fishing was always good, but because the drive there gave us an hour of quiet that belonged only to us. After Sadie moved in, the rods gathered dust. One afternoon, I found them leaning in the corner behind boxes of seasonal pillows. The brackets were gone. Sadie had removed them because, she said, the wall looked cluttered and unsafe. I asked where the screws were. She said she did not know. Albert walked in during the conversation and said, "Dad, it is just gear." I remember looking at him then, really looking, trying to find the boy who once cried because a fish swallowed the hook too deeply, and he did not want it to suffer. "It is not just gear," I said. He sighed, not angrily, just tired, which somehow cut deeper. Sadie turned away with a little smile, because she had won without having to raise her voice. Later that night, I put the rods in the trunk of my car and drove to a storage unit across town. One of the first small acts of removal I performed before I understood that I was rehearsing my own escape. Money had its own language in that house, and Sadie became fluent in the dialect of making my resources sound communal, while my needs sounded personal. When the washing machine broke, she stood in the laundry room with a hand pressed against her forehead and said, We need to think about what makes sense for the household. The household meant my checkbook. When Albert wanted new tires, she said, safety is not really optional. Safety meant my savings. When I mentioned that my dental work might cost more than expected, she frowned and said, maybe we should all tighten our belts for a bit. All meant me. They ate takeout twice that week. I learned to hear those distinctions. I learned that investment meant something they wanted, while expense meant something I needed. I learned that family budget meant Edward pays now, and nobody mentions it later. The worst part was that I had spent my entire adult life being careful with money, not because I worshipped it, but because money, properly managed, gives people choices. I had wanted Albert to have choices. I had wanted Margaret to feel safe. I had wanted old age to contain a little travel, maybe a porch with mountains, maybe the kind of ease we had postponed during the working years. Instead, I was financing the illusion of my son's adulthood, while eating soup from cans Sadie said were better for me. The doctor's appointment that changed everything had begun with an ordinary lie. Sadie had asked me to reschedule because she needed me to wait for a furniture delivery, and for one humiliating second I considered doing it. The appointment had been on the calendar for 3 months. My blood pressure had been high. I had been dizzy in the mornings. Still, her inconvenience arrived in the room with more authority than my health. I was reaching for the phone to call the clinic when Margaret's photograph caught my eye from the hallway table, the one Sadie had not yet moved. I remembered the last week of her life, how she gripped my wrist and made me promise not to neglect my own body after she was gone. So I told Sadie I was going. She stared at me as if I had spoken rudely. Fine, she said, but if they leave the couch on the porch because you are not here, that will be on you. At the clinic, Dr. Martinez asked why I looked thinner. I said I had been busy. He asked whether I was eating. I said yes. He asked who cooked at home. I said I did. He asked whether I enjoyed cooking. I said I used to. That was when he stopped typing. Sometimes a person does not need to hear a confession. They only need to hear the verb tense change. Robert Chen's second meeting was harder than the first because he asked me to bring documents, bank statements, mortgage statements, utility bills, insurance, receipts for repairs, anything showing who paid and who benefited. I arrived with a folder so thick it barely closed, and when he spread the papers across his conference table, my life became evidence. There was the roof invoice paid from my savings, the sectional furniture charge on my credit card, grocery bills that doubled after Albert and Sadie moved in, utility increases, checks written to contractors, cash withdrawals around holidays. Robert did not need to say much. The columns spoke with a cruelty numbers often have because numbers do not care about excuses. He took out a yellow legal pad and wrote 2 figures. What you contributed, what they contributed. The first column ran down the page. The second had almost nothing in it. I looked at that page until the room blurred. It was not greed that hurt me. It was the realization that I had confused sacrifice with relationship. I had been paying to remain near my son, and nobody had even had the decency to name the transaction. There was a dinner party in January that became one of the final nails, though I did not know it then. Sadie invited 2 couples from Albert's office, people with polished shoes and careful laughter. I cooked for 2 days, braised short ribs, roasted vegetables, homemade rolls from Margaret's recipe, apple cake with extra cinnamon because some habits survive even contempt. Sadie placed candles on the table and told me to wear something nice, but not hover too much once guests arrived. I served the meal because she said it would be awkward if everyone had to pass heavy dishes. The guests praised the food. One man asked where Sadie had ordered the rolls. She laughed and said, Edward made them. He is very useful in the kitchen. Useful, not talented, not generous, useful. Later, while clearing plates, I heard Albert's coworker say, must be nice having your dad around to help. Albert answered, it works out, he needs things to do. I stood in the hallway with a stack of plates in my hands, listening to my son explain away my labor as therapy. A ribbon of gravy slid from one plate onto my wrist, hot enough to burn. I did not move until the pain forced me back into my body. The cleaning schedule was printed on thick paper with color-coded sections. Sadie had laminated it. That detail still astonishes me. Lamination implies permanence. She had stood in the kitchen, pleased with herself, explaining that organization would reduce misunderstandings. Daily wipe-downs, weekly deep cleanse, monthly closet reviews, seasonal donation sweeps. She used phrases like shared standards and household rhythm. I asked whether Albert had seen it. She said, "Albert trusts me to manage the home. The home. My home." I wanted to tear the paper in half. Instead, I looked at the neat boxes and thought of Margaret's handwriting on recipe cards. Loose, slanted, alive. Sadie's schedule had no life in it. It was control disguised as help. I taped it inside the pantry door because she was watching, then stood there after she walked away, touching the edge of the laminated sheet. A man can recognize his own humiliation and still obey it. That is the part people who have never been slowly diminished do not understand. Albert's promotion should have been a moment of repair. That is why it hurt so much. Even after everything, some part of me believed success might soften him, might make him remember who had helped him climb. I imagined him saying, "Dad, I want you there tonight." I imagined Sadie forced to make room because the occasion was too important for pettiness. I imagined a toast where Albert would mention Margaret, and I would raise a glass quietly because I knew my wife would have been proud. Hope is stubborn in parents. It survives evidence that would kill it in anyone else. So when Sadie said immediate family, it did not merely exclude me from dinner. It killed the last childish belief that Albert's better self would appear at the exact moment I needed him. That was why the meatloaf mattered. It was not about food. It was the receipt for years of denial. It was proof that I had become someone to be managed in the margins, while the family celebrated in the center. Writing the letter took longer than packing, because every sentence had to fight the old instinct to soften itself. I kept wanting to add, "I know you did not mean it," or "I hope we can talk soon," or "please understand." Those phrases were trapped. They would have given them handles. Sadie would have grabbed the softness and pulled until the whole boundary came loose. So I wrote plainly, "The house is sold. I am gone. The apartment is available. Your belongings must be removed." I did not call them parasites. I did not list every insult. I did not tell Albert that the sound of his car leaving without me had changed the temperature of my blood. I gave facts because facts are harder to gaslight. Still, at the bottom of the page, my hand hovered. I wanted to write "Love, Dad." I could not. I wrote "Edward." Then, because that felt too cold even for the man I had become that night, I added one sentence before the signature. "I hope one day you understand why this had to happen." That was the only door I left unlocked. Albert later told me what happened when they came home, though I did not ask for every detail. Sadie saw the Hendersons' agent's card on the counter first and thought it was junk mail. Albert found the letter. He read the first paragraph twice because his mind would not accept the words. Sadie snatched it from him halfway through and began screaming before she reached the end. "They called me from the kitchen, the hallway, the driveway. They called Robert Chen's office. They called Clara Benson." Sadie threatened lawsuits, elder competency hearings, police reports, fraud claims. The Hendersons arrived at 8:30 the next morning with a moving van scheduled for noon, and 2 children excited about choosing rooms. Albert said he had never felt smaller than when Mrs. Henderson asked gently whether they needed help carrying boxes. Sadie refused help and told the woman she was participating in theft. The little boy started crying. "That image stayed with Albert," he wrote, not because Sadie embarrassed herself, but because a child entering his new home had been made afraid by the people who had lost the right to remain in it. Riverside Gardens did what consequences often do. It removed space from their excuses. In my house, Sadie could perform success. The wide living room, the garden, the guest room, the dinner parties, the furniture. All of it helped her maintain the fiction that she and Albert had built something. In the apartment, there was nowhere for the lie to stretch. The kitchen was narrow. The bedroom barely fit their bed. The parking lot light shone through thin blinds. Neighbors heard arguments. Bills arrived without my checkbook beneath them. Albert had to carry laundry to a shared machine and wait for quarters. Sadie hated every inch of it because it reflected reality without flattering her. Albert hated it at first because he thought discomfort meant injustice. Then slowly, he began to understand that discomfort can also be information. When Sadie came to Asheville, she was not trying to reconcile. She was trying to restore a system. That is why she miscalculated. She thought the right sequence of words could reactivate the old Edward. Concern, guilt, emergency, insult, threat. She had used that sequence for years, but systems fail when the power source is removed, and I had finally removed my need to be approved by her. The moment I saw her standing in the community center lobby, looking at the donated books and folding chairs with disdain, I understood that she had learned nothing from losing the house. She did not miss me. She missed infrastructure. She missed meals appearing, bills shrinking, rooms opening, problems dissolving before they reached her. When she said Albert might end up homeless, she was not asking for compassion. She was presenting me with a role and expecting me to step back into costume. I did not. The shock on her face when I refused was almost sad. Almost. Albert's divorce from Sadie was not immediate because control rarely releases cleanly. He wrote that after she returned from Asheville, she became colder, then louder, then theatrical. She told him I had turned selfish in old age. She told him I had probably hidden money from Margaret too. She told him he was weak for wanting to apologize. She called my new life pathetic, then demanded he convince me to fund them. One night during an argument she said, "Your father was only useful because he wanted to be needed." Albert told me that sentence was the first time he heard her clearly, not because it was the worst thing she had said, but because there was no anger in it. It was analysis. She had understood the wound and used it. He moved out 2 weeks later. I wish I could say that gave me satisfaction. It gave me confirmation, which is colder. Jennifer entered the story like someone walking into a room after a fire, careful not to pretend the smoke was gone. She did not call me dad. She did not ask why I had not attended the wedding. She did not tell me family should heal. Her first note was respectful, and that respect created more possibility than any demand for closeness could have. Albert chose differently with her, or was trying to. He wrote that when Jennifer disagreed, she did not punish him with silence. When she was angry, she said she was angry. When he apologized vaguely, she asked for specifics. He found that terrifying. I found it hopeful. A man raised by a good mother can still become cowardly under the wrong pressures, but he can also relearn courage if he stops calling fear peace. The community center became the place where my pain turned useful without becoming servitude. That difference saved me. In my old house, helping meant disappearing. At the center, helping meant sitting beside another person while they remained responsible for their own life. I did not pay Mrs. Patterson's bills. I helped her read them. I did not rescue Mr. Alvarez from his grandson's debts. I helped him open a separate account. I did not tell lonely people what to do. I showed them options. Robert had done that for me. Maybe that is the cleanest form of kindness, not carrying someone forever, but reminding them they still have legs. My birthday party in Asheville was small, but every detail contradicted the life I had left. Nora Coleman brought biscuits because she wanted to, not because I needed to earn them. Patricia teased me about my porch plants, because siblings can insult without reducing. The hiking group gave me a ridiculous walking stick carved with my initials, and nobody said it was because I was old. They said every mountain man needed one. We ate cake before dinner because someone suggested it, and no one cared about proper order. I spilled coffee on the tablecloth, and Nora laughed, dabbed it with a napkin, and continued her story. No sigh, no correction, no performance of tolerance. That moment nearly undid me. Not the cake, not the gifts, but the absence of punishment for being human. There is a photograph from that birthday that Patricia took without telling me. I am sitting on the porch with my head turned toward the mountains, laughing at something out of frame. When she mailed me a copy, I stared at it for a long time because I did not recognize the man immediately. He looked older than I felt and freer than I expected. His shoulders were not hunched. His hands were open. There was no one in the picture waiting to be served. I placed it beside Margaret's photograph, not because it equaled that old happiness, but because it proved another kind had become possible. Grief did not leave the room. It simply made space for a second chair. Sometimes people ask whether I regret leaving the way I did, without one final conversation. I have considered that question honestly. A final conversation would have given Albert a chance to stop me, yes, but it also would have given Sadie a chance to turn my boundary into a debate. She would have cried. She would have accused. She would have questioned my competence. Albert would have begged for time. I would have seen his panic and mistaken it for love. The house would not have sold. The meatloaf would have been heated. The cleaning schedule would still be inside the pantry door. Some exits must be made before the people who benefit from your staying realize the door is open. I do not regret the silence. I regret needing it. The old life still visits in dreams. In one dream, I am back in the kitchen, and the container labeled Edward is on the table, but when I open it, it is empty. Sadie stands by the refrigerator smiling. Albert is upstairs calling everyone to Romano's. Margaret is in the garden, visible through the window, but every time I try to speak, no sound comes out. I wake from that dream with my heart pounding and the Asheville room dark around me. Then I get up, walk to the kitchen, open the refrigerator, and look at the unlabeled containers inside. Soup, chicken, sliced peaches, leftover pasta. Food I cooked because I wanted it. No name, no permission. The ordinary sight calms me more than prayer. I still own the watch Margaret gave me for our 25th anniversary. I wear it on days when I need to remember time belongs to the living too. On the back she had engraved, "For all our tomorrows." For years after she died, that phrase felt cruel. There were no tomorrows with her, only days after. Now I understand it differently. She did not promise she would be in every tomorrow. She reminded me that tomorrows would still come, and that I had a responsibility to meet them as more than a ghost. Leaving my house was the first tomorrow I chose without her hand in mine. It hurt. It still hurts, but sometimes keeping faith with the dead means refusing to let the living bury you beside them. If Margaret Rose ever asks about the old house, I will tell her the truth carefully. I will not hand a child bitterness as inheritance. I will tell her that her father made mistakes and tried to become better. I will tell her that her grandmother Margaret loved lavender and apple cake and dancing in kitchens. I will tell her that houses can hold love, but they cannot create it for people who refuse to practice it. I will tell her that generosity is beautiful when it walks beside self-respect. If she asks why I left, I will say, because sometimes staying teaches people the wrong lesson about how to treat you. That will be enough until she is older. Later, if she wants the whole story, I will give it to her without dramatics, because truth does not need decoration when it has survived. The first time I understood that Sadie was not merely particular but strategic was during a grocery trip on a rainy Thursday, 3 years before I left. She had given me a list written in categories: produce, dairy, pantry, household, and beside each item she had written brand names in parentheses. I remember standing in aisle 7 at the supermarket, holding 2 kinds of olive oil, unable to find the imported one she preferred. My phone buzzed 3 times before I answered. "Where are you?" she asked, as if location were evidence. I told her. She exhaled through her nose. "Edward, I wrote it down. I said they did not have that brand. Then send me a picture of the shelf." I stood there under fluorescent lights, surrounded by strangers pushing carts, and took a picture of olive oil to prove my honesty to a woman living under my roof. When I came home, she checked the receipt item by item, while Albert sat at the island eating chips from a bag I had bought. She found that I had purchased the wrong paper towels. They were acceptable, she said, but more expensive per sheet. Then she looked at Albert and smiled with weary affection. "This is why I say systems matter." He laughed lightly, not at me exactly, but near me, close enough that I felt the warmth of humiliation on my face. That night I dreamed of supermarket aisles with no exits, every shelf labeled with my name. Another time I caught Albert alone in the garage, holding Margaret's old pruning gloves. Sadie had put them in a donation box because they were stiff with age, and no one used them. He was turning them over in his hands, thumb brushing the worn leather where Margaret's fingers had shaped them. For one suspended moment, I thought grief might open him. I said, "Your mother wore those every spring." He nodded and did not look up. "She used to get mad when I stepped in the flower beds," he said. His voice was small. I took one step closer. "She never stayed mad long," I said. He smiled faintly. Then Sadie called from inside, "Albert, we are late." And the gloves went back into the box as if the sound of her voice had snapped a cord. He stood, wiped his hands on his pants, and said, "Dad, maybe it is time to let some things go." He carried the box to the trunk. I watched Margaret's gloves disappear under a pile of things Sadie had decided were clutter. That was the day I rented the storage unit, not because of the gloves alone, but because I realized memories were not safe in a house where convenience outranked reverence. Sadie had a special talent for making public affection feel like private mockery. At church, when she still attended twice a month for reputation, she would touch my arm and tell people, "We are so blessed Edward is with us. He keeps the house from feeling empty." People would smile, moved by the image of multi-generational closeness, and I would stand beside her feeling like a prop in a story she was telling for applause. Once Mrs. Alvarez from the choir said, Your son is lucky to have you nearby." Before I could answer, Sadie said, "We all make sacrifices." Her hand tightened lightly on my sleeve. Not enough to hurt, enough to remind. In the car afterward, I said I did not like being described that way. Albert frowned from the driver's seat, already uncomfortable. Sadie looked out the window and said, "I was complimenting you. Why do you always hear criticism?" The conversation ended there, because I had been repositioned from injured to oversensitive. That was another of her methods. She made the wound, then questioned the skin. There were changes in Albert's face over time, and I missed them because I was too busy surviving Sadie's. He became less expressive, less spontaneous, always glancing toward her before answering invitations or questions. When Jennifer, his sister, invited him to a family barbecue, he looked at Sadie before saying yes. When I asked if he wanted to watch the game with me, he said, "Let me check what we have going on," though we meant her. At first I blamed Sadie entirely, and she earned plenty of blame, but the sadder truth was that Albert found safety in surrender. He let her make decisions, because then he did not have to risk making wrong ones. He let her manage the house, because then he could call himself busy. He let her manage me, because then he did not have to confront the growing evidence that he was benefiting from my reduction. A weak man can look gentle from a distance. Up close, weakness often feels like abandonment. The house showings became secret funerals. Each time Clara called to say a buyer wanted to walk through, I cleaned with a tenderness I no longer offered Sadie's guest. I polished the banister not because I wanted approval, but because I wanted the next family to see what Margaret and I had built before the last 5 years covered it. I opened curtains Sadie liked closed. I placed Margaret's recipe box on the kitchen counter for one showing, then removed it because I could not bear strangers touching it. I stood across the street, pretending to check my mail, while people entered through my front door with Clara. I watched their faces in the windows. Some saw square footage, some saw school district, some saw resale value. The Hendersons saw home. That distinction matters more than price. After the closing, Robert asked if I wanted to delay departure a week to make the transition easier for my son. The question irritated me, and then the irritation frightened me because it showed how close rage had come to the surface. Easier for my son had been the governing principle of my life for too long. Easier for Albert meant I absorbed the shock. Easier for Albert meant I paid the bill, swallowed the insult, adjusted the plan, gave up the room, smiled at Sadie. I told Robert no. He nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something he hoped I would reach on my own. Then he slid the final documents toward me and said, "After tonight, do not negotiate from guilt. Negotiate only through writing, if you must negotiate at all." I wrote that down. It became a rule I carried across state lines. At Romano's, according to a photo Sadie posted before she knew her life had shifted, Albert sat at the center of a long table, a dessert plate in front of him with congratulations written in chocolate on the rim. Sadie leaned into his shoulder, smiling brightly. Her parents sat to his right. Jennifer and Tom raised glasses. Everyone looked warm, included, polished by restaurant lighting. I saw the photo 2 months later, when Patricia showed it to me after finding it online. For a moment, I could not breathe, not because they looked happy without me. I had already known that, because on the table in front of Albert, beside the dessert plate, was the watch I had given him when he graduated college. He wore it to mark the success he had celebrated by leaving me at home with labeled leftovers. I closed the laptop without speaking. Patricia put her hand over mine and said, "Sometimes evidence arrives late, but it still tells the truth." The morning after I arrived in Asheville, I walked through the cottage and assigned the rooms names, a habit Margaret and I once had when we moved into our first apartment. The front room became the reading room, though it held only one chair at first. The smaller bedroom became the guest room, not because I expected many guests, but because naming it that felt like an act of faith. The kitchen became mine immediately. I placed Margaret's recipe cards in the top drawer, not hidden, not protected from Sadie, simply available. I put my coffee wherever I wanted. I set the mugs on the open shelf, with handles facing no particular direction. That disorder delighted me. For 5 years, Sadie had arranged visible spaces for impression. Now the house arranged itself around use. A spoon could remain on the counter without becoming symbolic of decline. A jacket could hang on a chair without suggesting loss of standards. I was astonished by how much freedom lived in small messes. Mrs. Coleman became my first witness in Asheville. She did not ask for the whole story at once. She brought biscuits, then tomatoes, then a newspaper clipping about a community concert, each offering paired with one careful question. Married, widowed, children, recently moved, sleeping all right, eating enough. She collected information the way good neighbors do, not to control, but to know how to stand nearby. When I finally told her about the promotion dinner, she did not gasp or tell me how awful it was. She said that must have made the house very cold. I remember that sentence because it was exactly right. Cruelty changes temperature before it changes circumstance. My old house had been cold for years, even in summer. The first time I volunteered at the Asheville Community Center, I nearly left before signing in. The bulletin board was crowded with flyers about grief support, tax help, chair yoga, caregiver respite, senior fraud prevention. Fraud prevention caught my eye and made me laugh under my breath. I wondered whether being slowly turned into unpaid help counted as fraud if no one forged a signature. The director, Elaine Foster, asked what kind of work I had done before retirement. I said electrical utility administration, budgeting, maintenance oversight. Her eyes lit up as if I had described treasure. Do you know how many people come in here terrified of bills they cannot understand? She asked. I said probably many. She handed me a stack of sample forms and said, then sit with them. Do not lecture. Sit. That instruction changed everything. Sitting beside someone without taking over became the opposite of what my family had demanded. It restored the part of usefulness that did not require self-erasure. When Sadie threatened homelessness, I spent that night awake despite my firm answer. Boundaries do not erase imagination. I pictured Albert sleeping in his car. I pictured Sadie crying in a motel. I pictured Margaret looking disappointed, though that was my guilt borrowing her face. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and made tea. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote 2 columns, just as Robert had taught me. What is mine to carry? What is theirs? Under mine I wrote my safety, my health, my home, my grief, my choices, my dignity. Under theirs I wrote rent, employment, marriage, spending, consequences, apologies, repair. Then I added 1 line beneath both columns. Love does not move items from their column into mine. I taped that paper inside a kitchen cabinet. It is still there. Albert's first true change showed in what he stopped doing. He stopped asking where I lived exactly. He stopped suggesting quick fixes. He stopped mentioning Sadie's feelings as if they were whether everyone had to accommodate. He stopped saying, I know you are hurt, and began saying, I hurt you. The grammar mattered. Responsibility often hides in grammar. When he wrote, mistakes were made, I did not answer. When he wrote, I made mistakes, I did. Training a son at 34 is a strange thing. You cannot raise him again, but you can refuse to participate in the habits that kept him childish. I met Albert once halfway between Asheville and his apartment after the divorce papers were filed. We chose a diner off the interstate, neutral and ugly, with weak coffee and vinyl booths. He arrived early and stood when I approached. That small act moved me more than I wanted. We talked for 90 minutes. He did not cry. He did not ask for money. He told me about job interviews, therapy, the way he was beginning to notice how often he apologized to avoid conflict rather than to repair harm. He asked about my hiking group. He asked what Margaret's favorite flower had been because he realized he had forgotten. Lavender, I said. He wrote it down. Near the end, he said, I do not know how to make up for letting you become invisible. I told him you cannot make up for it. You can only become someone who would not allow it again. He nodded and looked out the window for a long time. When we parted, he did not hug me until I opened my arms first. That restraint was new. It gave me more hope than the hug. Sadie's final message came through an email account I had forgotten to block. It was long, polished, and poisonous. She wrote that I had destroyed her marriage, traumatized Albert, humiliated her socially, and weaponized old age to avoid accountability. She said I had always resented her because she saw through my victim act. She said Margaret would be ashamed of me. That last line sat on the screen like a dead insect. For a moment, anger rose so sharply I drafted a reply. I wrote 3 paragraphs. I listed facts. I defended Margaret. I defended myself. Then I deleted it. Some people send messages not to communicate, but to reopen a courtroom where they can keep trying the case. I refused to attend. I printed the email, placed it in a folder labeled Sadie, and wrote on the outside, do not answer ghost. Jennifer's pregnancy did not magically repair Albert. Fatherhood exposes what people have not resolved. In one letter, he admitted he was terrified that he would become passive again, That conflict with Jennifer would send him back into silence, that his daughter would one day watch him fail someone the way I watched him fail me. I respected that fear because it did not ask me to soothe it. He wrote, "I am telling my therapist these things before they become behavior." That sentence gave me more faith in him than any apology had. Prevention is a different moral category than regret. The first deposit I made into Margaret Rose's account was small, $50. I stood at the bank counter feeling foolish, as if the teller could see the entire family history behind the transaction. She asked the purpose of the account. I said education. Then I corrected myself. Future. The word felt better. Education was too narrow. Future could mean college, trade school, rent, escape, art supplies, a car that starts, a security deposit on a room of her own. I did not want to build another lesh out of money. I wanted to build a door. Patricia once asked whether I missed the old house, or the idea of who I had been inside it. We were sitting on my porch during her Thanksgiving visit, wrapped in blankets, drinking coffee gone lukewarm. I wanted to say the house because that answer was simpler. Instead I said, I miss being certain I belonged somewhere. She leaned back and nodded. Then build belonging here without giving anyone the deed to your soul, she said. Patricia has always been the kind of woman who can make a sentence sound like both comfort and instruction. I think about that often when someone new enters my life. I can welcome people now without handing them keys to rooms they have not earned. I keep the old letter, the one I left Albert and Sadie, in my desk drawer. Robert has a copy. Sometimes I read it when memory tries to soften the past too much. Not often, only when nostalgia becomes dishonest. The letter is not elegant. It is not perfectly written. It is the work of a shaking hand and a wounded man trying to escape before love talked him out of survival. I honor that man now. For a long time, I felt embarrassed by his anger. Now I understand that his anger carried me when hope had become dangerous. Without him, I would still be in that kitchen, heating the meatloaf. The emotional aftermath did not move in a straight line. There were weeks I felt free, and then one ordinary sound would pull me backward. A fork scraping a plate in a restaurant, a woman saying, "Be reasonable," in the grocery aisle, a red dress in a shop window, the smell of meatloaf from a diner special. Trauma does not always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it taps your shoulder while you are buying bananas. I learned to pause, breathe, name the memory, and let the present return. Asheville helped because it did not ask me to pretend I was always fine. The mountains do not care whether a man cries on his porch. They simply remain. The second birthday in Asheville was easier than the first, and sadder in a quieter way. Albert sent a card, handwritten, with no plea inside. Jennifer signed it. There was a tiny footprint from Margaret Rose in blue ink. I placed it on the mantel and looked at it during breakfast. A family can continue in fragments. A footprint can arrive where an embrace cannot. That afternoon, I hiked 3 miles with the group and told no one it was my birthday until Nora produced cupcakes from her backpack at the Overlook. Everyone sang badly. I laughed because they were terrible, and because for once the celebration did not require me to earn my chair. I do not know whether I will ever sit across a holiday table from Albert again. If I do, the table will be different, not because of location, but because I will not bring the old version of myself to it. I will not jump up to clear plates before anyone asks. I will not pay for peace. I will not smile at disrespect to protect the mood. I will be kind, but I will not be convenient. That distinction is the border of my new life. In the evenings, when the cottage settles and the refrigerator hums softly, I sometimes think about Sadie's phrase, "Know your place." She meant below. She meant useful. She meant quiet. She meant available. It took me years to answer, but I finally did. My place is not at the edge of my son's celebration waiting for scraps. My place is not in a labeled container. My place is not inside anyone's version of family that requires my disappearance. My place is here in a small kitchen near the mountains, with Margaret's photograph in the light, my own key in my pocket, and a silence that belongs to me. What I haven't told you yet is that while Albert and Sadie were out celebrating his promotion, I wasn't just sitting in that kitchen feeling sorry for myself. I was executing a plan I'd been working on for the past 6 months, ever since the day Sadie told me I needed to contribute more meaningfully to the household by taking over all the grocery shopping, cooking, and cleaning. That was the day I started seeing a lawyer. Robert Chen did not save me. That distinction matters. He did not rescue me like a hero in a cheap story, and he did not give me courage wrapped in legal language. What he gave me was structure, And sometimes structure is what courage needs before it can stand. In his office, beneath a framed print of the Golden Gate Bridge, he asked questions that left no room for the fog I had been living in. Who paid the mortgage? Who paid property taxes? Who bought groceries? Who cooked? Who cleaned? Who held legal title? Who had access to accounts? Who benefited from the arrangement? Who was harmed by it? The first time he asked those questions, I answered like a man defending defendants at trial. Albert was under pressure. Sadie had high standards. I was retired. I did not mind. Robert wrote nothing for a full minute, then looked up and said, "Edward, I am not asking whether you can explain their behavior. I am asking whether you can survive it without disappearing." That sentence followed me home and sat beside me at dinner, while Sadie complained that the green beans were overcooked. It followed me the next morning, while I scrubbed toothpaste from the upstairs sink. It followed me when Albert walked past the laundry basket at the foot of the stairs and called down, "Dad, can you get this when you have a second?" Disappearing was not dramatic. It was practical. It wore slippers. It remembered trash day. It knew where the extra batteries were. It was praised for being easy. After that meeting, I began documenting, not to punish them at first, to prove to myself that I was not imagining it. Grocery receipts, utility bills, repair invoices, notes about conversations, dates when Sadie insulted me in ways she could later call jokes, dates when Albert promised to talk to her and never did. The notebook filled slowly, and with every page my denial thinned. His name was Robert Chen, and his office was in a modest building downtown far enough from our neighborhood that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. I'd found him through a recommendation from my doctor, who'd noticed I'd been losing weight and seemed stressed during my last physical. "Are you being mistreated at home, Edward?" Dr. Martinez had asked gently. Sometimes adult children can become demanding when they live with aging parents. I'd laughed it off at the time, but he slipped me Robert's business card anyway, just in case you ever need someone to talk to about your options. He'd said it took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to call. Robert was younger than I expected. May be in his 40s, with kind eyes and a way of listening that reminded me of my late wife. During our first meeting, I explained my situation, feeling foolish and disloyal. As I described how I'd become a servant in my own home, "Edward," he said, after I finished, "what you're describing is a form of elder abuse. It's more common than you might think." Elder abuse. The words hit me like a cold slap. I'd never thought of it that way, but hearing it said out loud made something click into place. "What are my options?" I'd asked. That's when Robert explained something that shocked me. The house was entirely in my name. When Margaret and I had bought it 32 years ago, we'd put it in my name alone because I had better credit after she died. I'd never added Albert to the deed despite Sadie's hints that I should consider the family's future security. "You have more power than you realize," Robert had told me. "This is your property. You can make decisions about it without anyone's permission." Over the next several months, Robert helped me understand my financial situation better than I had in years. I wasn't just scraping by on Social Security like Albert and Sadie assumed. I had Margaret's life insurance money still mostly untouched. I had my pension from 38 years at the electric company. I had savings and investments that I'd been too depressed to pay attention to after Margaret died. Most importantly, I had a house worth approximately $420. $0 in today's market. You could sell this house tomorrow and have enough money to live comfortably anywhere you want. Robert had explained you could buy something smaller, maybe in a senior community, and have money left over for travel, hobbies, whatever you want to do with your retirement. The idea had seemed impossible at first. This was the family home. This was where Albert grew up, where Margaret and I built our life together. How could I sell it? But as the months passed and the disrespect continued to escalate, I began to see the house differently. It wasn't a family home anymore. It was a prison where I'd volunteered to be the unpaid staff. 3 months ago, I'd made my decision. Selling the house required a brutality I did not know I possessed. Not loud brutality, quiet brutality, which is harder because no anger carries you through it. Clara Benson, the agent, came first on a rainy Wednesday while Albert and Sadie were at work. I watched her walk through the rooms, touching banisters, checking windows, measuring light. She spoke respectfully, but even respect hurt because it reminded me how long I had lived without it. When she said the house would show beautifully, I almost told her not to list it. I almost said this was a mistake, that my son needed stability, that Margaret would not want strangers in her garden. Then Clara stepped into the kitchen, saw the container labeled Edward in the refrigerator because I had forgotten to remove it, and her face changed. She looked away quickly, politely, but not quickly enough. That was the moment I signed the listing agreement. Over the next 6 weeks, strangers walked through my memories while I pretended to be at doctor appointments. Some complained that the closets were small. Some said the bathrooms needed updating. One woman stood in Margaret's garden and said she would rip out the lavender to put in a patio, and I nearly ended the showing. Then the Hendersons came. They were not glamorous. He had paint on one cuff. She carried a toddler on her hip and apologized twice for the child touching things. Their older boy ran his hand along the stair rail and whispered that the house felt like a storybook. Mrs. Henderson stood in the garden and asked who planted the lavender. My wife, I said. She looked at me then, not with pity, but with recognition. We would keep it, she said. All of it. That answer sold the house more than their offer did. I listed the house with a real estate agent in the next county, someone who wouldn't know Albert or Sadie. I'd been showing it on weekdays when they were at work, telling them I was at the doctor or running errands. The house sold in 6 weeks tonight, while they celebrated Albert's promotion at Romano's. I wasn't just packing my clothes, I was executing the final phase of a plan that would give me my life back. The night of packing was not a clean act of liberation. Freedom can be clumsy. I opened drawers and forgot why I had opened them. I picked up one of Margaret's scarves and sat on the bed for 10 minutes with it pressed against my face, breathing in dust and cedar and the last imagined trace of her. I found old birthday cards from Albert, the childish ones first, crooked letters and sticker stars, then teenage cards signed with only his name, then adult cards chosen by Sadie, tasteful and empty. I kept the childish ones. I left the others. In the garage, I stood before my tools, knowing I could not take them all, and felt ridiculous grief over a socket set. A life is not only photographs and jewelry. It is also the wrench you used to fix a crib, the level you held while your wife told you the shelf was still crooked, the coffee can full of screws sorted by habit and hope. I took what fit in one toolbox and left the rest on the workbench with a note for Mr. Henderson. Good tools, use them well. In the bathroom, I looked at my toothbrush in the cup beside the sink and realized even that object had been moved twice by Sadie because it made the counter look cluttered. I threw it away and bought a new one at a gas station 2 hours later. That absurdly made me cry harder than leaving the house. I walked through each room of the house, taking only what was truly mine: my clothes, my books, my photo albums, the watch Margaret had given me for our 25th anniversary. I left behind all the furniture Sadie had picked out, all the expensive electronics Albert had insisted we needed, all the things that had transformed my home into their showcase. I packed everything into 3 suitcases and loaded them into my car. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and began writing the letter I'd been composing in my mind for months. Albert and Sadie, I wrote, by the time you read this, I will be gone. The house has been sold. The closing was yesterday, and the new owners take possession tomorrow. Morning, your belongings need to be removed by 9:00 a.m. I paused, imagining their faces when they read those words. Part of me felt guilty, but a larger part felt something I hadn't experienced in years: relief. You have been living in my house for 5 years, I continued. During that time, I have paid the mortgage, utilities, insurance, property taxes, and maintenance costs. I have cooked your meals, cleaned your messes, and subsidized your lifestyle while being treated like hired help in my own home. My hand was shaking slightly as I wrote, but I kept going. Albert, I raised you to be a better man than this. I supported your education, your career, your dreams, and your marriage. In return, you allowed your wife to treat me with contempt while you stood by and said nothing. You have excluded me from family celebrations, dismissed my opinions, and made me feel unwelcome in my own home. I stopped writing and looked around the kitchen one more time. Tomorrow morning, this would all belong to the Hendersons, a young couple with 2 small children who'd fallen in love with the house's character and warmth. They'd promised to take good care of Margaret's garden. The proceeds from the sale, after paying off the remaining mortgage balance of $68.00, will allow me to start over somewhere new. I have purchased a small house in Asheville, North Carolina, where I intend to live out my retirement in peace and dignity. Asheville had been Margaret's dream destination. We'd planned to visit there for our 40th anniversary, maybe even retire there someday. Now I was going alone, but somehow that felt right. It would be a fresh start, a place where no one knew me as the sad old widower who let his family walk all over him. I am leaving the apartment at Riverside Gardens, I wrote, referring to the 1-bedroom rental property I'd owned for 15 years and had never mentioned to them. The rent is $800 per month, utilities not included. The current tenant's lease expires next week. So you can move in immediately if you wish. This was my one concession to guilt. I wasn't leaving them homeless, but I wasn't making it easy for them either. The apartment was small, nothing like the spacious house they'd grown accustomed to, and they'd have to pay rent for the first time in 5 years. The furniture, appliances, and other household items in this house belong to you now as a gift, considerate compensation for the 5 years free labor you received from me. I sealed the letter in an envelope and left it on the kitchen table, weighted down with Margaret's old cookie jar. Then I walked through the house one final time, turning off lights and checking that windows were locked. Habits from 32 years of home ownership that died hard at the front door. I paused and looked back at the living room where Albert had taken his first steps, where we'd celebrated countless birthdays and holidays, where Margaret and I had slow danced to our wedding song on quiet Sunday evenings. But I also saw the room where Sadie had told me I couldn't sit on the new furniture when they had company, where Albert had rolled his eyes when I tried to contribute to conversations about current events, where I'd been made to feel like an intruder in my own life. I locked the door and placed the keys in the mailbox. As I'd arranged with the real estate agent, tomorrow the Hendersons would pick them up and begin their own life in this house. I hoped they'd be happier here than I'd been these past 5 years. As I drove away, I didn't look back in my rear-view mirror. I could see the porch light glowing just like it had every night for 32 years. But for the first time in half a decade, I wouldn't be the one coming home to turn it off. I had 6 hours until Albert and Sadie returned from their celebration. By then I'd be 300 miles away, driving through the night toward a new life where no one would ever again mistake me for the help in my own home. The drive to Asheville became a trial conducted by darkness. Every mile asked whether I was cruel. Every exit offered a chance to turn around. At one point near midnight, I pulled into a gas station and watched a young father carry a sleeping child from the back seat into the restroom, the child's head heavy on his shoulder, one small hand gripping his collar. The sight nearly broke me. Albert had once slept that way against me. I remembered carrying him from the car after long family dinners, his warm breath against my neck, Margaret walking ahead to unlock the door, whispering not to wake him even though he could sleep through thunder. I sat in my car with the pump clicking beside me and asked out loud, "What happened to us?" No one answered. Then my phone lit with Albert's first call, and I understood that the answer was not one event, but 1,000 permissions. I had permitted too much. He had noticed too little. Sadie had taken exactly as much as the silence allowed. When I turned the key and pulled back onto the highway, I did not feel brave. I felt like a man amputating a limb to stop poison from reaching the heart. I was somewhere outside of Knoxville when my phone started ringing. It was 3:15 in the morning, and I'd been driving for nearly 6 hours, stopping only for gas and coffee. The mountain roads were dark and winding, but I felt more awake than I had in years. The caller ID showed Albert's name. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again, immediately and again. By the fourth call, I pulled over at a rest stop and turned off the phone entirely. I wasn't ready to hear his voice, yet I needed to reach Asheville first to see my new home, to make this real. Before dealing with their reaction, Asheville did not heal me quickly, and I distrust anyone who says a new place can. The first week, I woke in panic each morning because the house was too quiet. I would sit up thinking I had overslept, that Sadie would be angry there was no coffee, that Albert would need a shirt ironed, that groceries were due. Then I would remember the mountain window, the small kitchen, the absence of anyone waiting to be served. Relief came first as emptiness. I did not know what to do with hours that belonged to me. I rearranged the pantry 3 times. I swept a clean floor. I made too much food and stored leftovers in unlabeled containers, then laughed so suddenly that Mrs. Coleman knocked to ask if I was all right. Some afternoons I felt powerful. Others I felt discarded, as if leaving had only formalized what they already believed. Freedom did not remove grief. It removed the audience that had profited from it. I arrived in Asheville just as the sun was coming up over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The drive had been long, but seeing those rolling hills bathed in golden morning light made every mile worth it. This was where Margaret and I should have come together, but somehow doing it alone felt like keeping a promise to both of us. The house I'd bought was smaller than our old one, but it was mine completely, a 2-bedroom cottage with a wrap-around porch and a view of the mountains from the kitchen window. I'd purchased it sight unseen based on photos and a virtual tour, which was either the most reckless or most liberating thing I'd ever done. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Mrs. Coleman, the neighbor who'd been keeping an eye on the place, waving from her garden. "Next door, you must be Edward," she called out, walking over with a warm smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood. I've been looking forward to meeting you for the first time in 5 years." Someone was genuinely happy to see me, not because they needed something from me, not because I was useful to them, but simply because I was a new neighbor to welcome. Thank you, I said. And I meant it more than she could possibly know. I spent the morning unpacking my 3 suitcases and exploring my new home. The previous owners had left it furnished with simple, comfortable pieces that felt welcoming rather than intimidating. In the kitchen, I made my first cup of coffee and sat at the small table by the window, watching the mountains wake up in the distance at 10. I finally turned my phone back on. I had 17 missed calls and 12 voicemails, all from Albert, except for 3 calls from a number I didn't recognize, which I assumed was Sadie calling from her phone. I listened Ned to the first voicemail, steeling myself for what I knew was coming. Dad, what the hell is going on? Albert's voice was high with panic. We came home, and there are strangers in the house. They say they bought it. Call me back right now. The second message was angrier. Dad, this isn't funny. These people have paperwork saying they own our house. I want us to leave. Where are you? Call me back immediately. By the 5th message, Albert's voice had shifted from anger to something approaching desperation. Dad, please. I found your letter. I don't understand. We can work this out. Just call me back and tell me where you are. The last few messages were barely coherent. Albert was crying in one of them, something I hadn't heard since he was a child. In another, I could hear Sadie in the background, her voice shrill with rage. Though I couldn't make out the specific words, I deleted all the voicemails without listening to them completely. Then I blocked both their numbers for the next 3 days. I ignored the outside world completely. I explored Asheville, walking through the charming downtown area, visiting local shops, eating at small restaurants, where the servers actually seemed interested in conversation. I bought groceries for my own kitchen and cooked meals that I ate in peaceful silence, without anyone criticizing my choices or demanding that I clean up their messes. On the 4th day, Mrs. Coleman knocked on my door with a plate of homemade biscuits and some troubling news. Edward, I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but there's been a young man calling around the neighborhood, asking about you. He says he's your son, and that he's worried about you. My stomach tightened. What did you tell him? Nothing. Of course, I don't know anything about your personal business, and I told him so, but he seemed quite upset. He left his phone number and asked me to have you call him if I saw you. She handed me a piece of paper with Albert's number written on it in unfamiliar handwriting. Seeing it there in someone else's careful script made the whole situation feel suddenly real and final. Thank you for not giving him any information, I said. Mrs. Coleman studied my face with the kind of perception that comes from decades of life experience. Are you in some kind of trouble, Edward? Because if you are, there are resources available, people who can help. I almost laughed at the irony. People assuming I was the one who needed help, when for the first time in years, I was exactly where I needed to be. No trouble, I assured her, just some family complications. That I'm better off without. She nodded knowingly. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you need. There's no shame in choosing your own peace over other people's drama. That afternoon, I unblocked Albert's number long enough to send him a single text message. I am safe and well. Do not try to find me. I need space to live my own life. Please respect my decision. His response came within minutes. Dad, please, we need to talk. I'm sorry, Sadie, sorry. We can fix this. Just tell me where you are. I read his words. Something I hadn't expected. Nothing, no guilt, no wavering, no urge to make everything okay for everyone else at my own expense. Just a clear, calm certainty that I'd made the right choice. I typed back, the apartment at Riverside Gardens is available, $800 per month. First month's rent is due by the 15th. Take care of yourselves. Then I blocked High's number again, this time permanently. That evening, I sat on my new porch watching the sunset behind the mountains and listening to the sounds of my neighborhood coming alive for dinner. Children playing in yards, families talking over backyard barbecues, the normal sounds of people living their lives without drama or manipulation or the constant undercurrent of resentment that had poisoned my last 5 years. I thought about Albert and Sadie, probably spending their evening frantically calling relatives, trying to piece together how their comfortable arrangement had collapsed so suddenly. I wondered if they were genuinely sorry or just sorry that their situation had changed. I wondered if Albert was finally realizing how much he'd taken for granted, but mostly I found that I didn't wonder about them much at all. 2 weeks later, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. It was from Albert, handwritten on legal pad paper, which told me he was probably writing it late at night, when everything felt desperate and urgent. Dad, it began, I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need you to know that I understand now. I understand what Sadie and I did to you. I understand why you left. I understand that we treated you terribly. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I set the letter aside and made myself a cup of tea before continuing to read it. I wanted to approach his words with a clear head, not the emotional reactivity that had governed so much of my relationship with him over the past 5 years. We moved into the apartment you left for us. The letter continued. It's small and expensive, And nothing like the house we got used to. Sadie hates it. She says it's beneath us, that you're being cruel and vindictive, but I think I'm starting to understand that it's not about cruelty, it's about consequences. I felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. Maybe Albert was capable of growth. After all, I miss our Saturday morning breakfasts. He wrote, I miss our fishing trips. I miss having a father, instead of just someone who made my life. Asir, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I needed you to know that I finally see what I lost. The letter was 3 pages long, filled with memories of our relationship. Before Sadie, apologies for specific incidents. I'd thought he'd forgotten, and promises to do better if I'd give him another chance. At the end, he'd written, I love you, D. And I know I stopped showing it, but I never stopped feeling it. If you're willing to try again, I promise things will be different. I folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer with Margaret's jewelry and my other important papers. Then I walked out to my porch and sat in the rocking chair I'd bought at a local antique shop, watching the mountains fade into purple shadows as evening approached. Albert's letter was everything I'd wanted to hear for 5 years. It was an acknowledgement of his mistakes, a recognition of my worth, a promise that things could change. 6 months ago, receiving those words would have had me packing my bags to rush back and rebuild our relationship. But sitting there in the peaceful twilight of my new life, I realized something important. I didn't need his apology anymore. I'd already moved on. 3 months into my new life in Asheville, I was volunteering at the local community center twice a week, teaching basic financial literacy to seniors who'd found themselves struggling with money management. It was work that felt meaningful in a way I hadn't experienced since retiring from the electric company. On a Tuesday morning in July, while I was helping Mrs. Patterson understand her Medicare statements, the center's director approached me with an expression that immediately put me on alert. Edward, there's someone here to see you, she said quietly. A young woman. She says she's your daughter-in-law. My stomach dropped. I'd been living in peaceful anonymity for months, and the idea of Sadie finding me here in this safe space I'd created felt like a violation. I didn't give her any information about you, the director continued, but she's quite persistent. She says it's a family emergency. Of course she did. I thank Mrs. Patterson, told her we'd continue next week, and made my way to the lobby with heavy steps. Sadie's arrival at the community center was the old life stepping into the new one without permission. She had always understood presentation, and even in that modest lobby she performed injury beautifully. Her shoulders softened, her eyes shone, her voice trembled at exactly the right places. To anyone who did not know her, she looked like a worried daughter-in-law trying to recover a beloved elder. But I watched the details. Her gaze swept the room before it settled on me, evaluating witnesses. Her smile tightened when she saw I was not alone. Her fingers tapped once against her handbag when I refused the embrace. She had come expecting the old Edward, the man who would feel embarrassed by public tension and step outside to protect everyone else from discomfort. When I did not move, she adjusted. That was what made her dangerous. She did not need one method. She carried many. Concern first, then guilt, then financial fear, then Albert's depression, then family duty, then insult, then threat. She played them like keys on a piano, waiting for one note to make me flinch. Some did. I will not pretend otherwise. When she said Albert had lost his job, my chest tightened. When she said he blamed himself, my hand curled. When she said homeless, an old reflex rose so strongly that for a second I saw myself writing a check. But reflex is not command. I let it rise. I let it pass. Then I told her no. Sadie was standing by the window, looking entirely out of place in her designer clothes and perfect makeup, among the casual, comfortable atmosphere of the community center. When she saw me, her face immediately shifted into what I'd learned to recognize as her performance mode. Edward, she exclaimed, rushing toward me with her arms outstretched, as if we were long-lost relatives reuniting after years apart. Thank God I found you. We've been so worried. I stepped back before she could embrace me, keeping my voice level and quiet. How did you find me? Her smile faltered slightly. Albert hired a private investigator. We had to make sure you were safe. A private investigator? They'd spent moan. Why they didn't have to track me down rather than simply accepting my decision to leave. The fact that this didn't surprise me told me everything I needed to know about how little had really changed. I'm perfectly safe. I said, you can see that for yourself. Now you can go home. Sadie's expression shifted to the wounded look she'd perfected over the years. Edward, we need to talk. There are things you don't understand about our situation. Your situation is not my responsibility anymore. She glanced around the community center, taking in the modest surroundings with barely concealed disdain. This is where you're spending your time now. Edward, you could be living so much better than this. Why? O could come home, and we could work things out like a real family home. She still thought of my house as home, even though it now belonged to the Hendersons. And their 2 young children. I am home, I said simply. Sadie's mask slipped entirely. Then, revealing the calculating woman I'd learned to recognize underneath the sweet daughter-in-law. AC. Fine, she said, her voice hardening. Let's be honest. Then Albert lost his job. The words hit me like a cold shock. What, 2 weeks after you left, his company downsized, and his position was eliminated. We're struggling, Edward, really struggling. We can barely afford the rent on that tiny apartment you stuck us in. I felt a familiar stab of guilt. The same feeling that had kept me trapped for 5 years. But this time I recognized it for what it was, a conditioned response to their manufactured crises. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it, but Albert is a capable man with a good education. He'll find another job. Sadie's eyes flashed with something ugly. You don't understand. He's been depressed since you left. He blames himself, and it's affecting his ability to interview well. He needs his father's support. He had his father's support for 34 years. I replied. He chose to throw it away. We made mistakes, Sadie said, her voice taking on a pleading quality. But we're family. Families forgive each other. Families help each other through difficult times. I looked at her standing there in her expensive clothes, using emotional manipulation as naturally as breathing. And I felt something I'd never felt toward her before. Pity. You're right that families help each other, I said. But they also respect each other. They don't exclude family members from celebrations. They don't treat each other like servants. They don't take and take and take while giving nothing back but contempt. Sadie's composure cracked completely. You're a selfish old man, she hissed. We gave you purpose. We gave you a reason to get up in the morning. Without us, what are you, just another lonely old widower waiting to die? The words were meant to coo. And 6 months ago they would have, but sitting here in this place where I'd found genuine community and meaning, they felt like echoes from someone else's life. I think you should leave now, I said quietly. Albert is coming, she said, playing what she clearly thought was her trump card. He's driving down here tomorrow. He wants to see you, to apologize in person. My heart clenched. Despite myself, part of me did want to see Albert, to hear his apology, to believe that he genuinely changed. But I'd learned the difference between wanting something and needing it. Then I won't be here tomorrow, I said. Sadie stared at me in shock. You'd really avoid your own son? I'd avoid a conversation that would end with me feeling guilty for choosing my own well-being over your problems. I turned to walk away, but Sadie's voice followed me. The apartment lease is up next month, she called out. If you don't help us, we'll be homeless. Is that what you want, your son living on the streets? I stopped and turned back to her. For just a moment I saw her anger and manipulation to something that might have been genuine fear. But I'd spent too many years being responsible for other people's poor choices. Albert is 34 years old. I said. He has a college education, work experience, and family members besides me. If he ends up homeless, it won't be because his father chose to live his own life. That evening I called my sister Patricia in Oregon, something I should have done months ago. Edward, she exclaimed when she heard my voice. Where on earth have you been? Albert's been calling everyone in the family saying you disappeared. I explained the situation, starting with Margaret's death and ending with Sadie's visit that morning. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy or outrage. You did the right thing, she said firmly. When I finished, I never liked how that girl treated you when I visited, and Albert should have stood up for you years ago. They say he lost his job, so lots of people lose jobs. That doesn't give them the right to treat at their parents like personal servants. We talked for over an hour, and by the end of the conversation I felt lighter than I had all day. Patricia invited me to visit her in Portland, and I found myself actually considering it. When was the last time I'd made plans for myself without considering how they might inconvenience Albert and Sadie? The next morning I drove up to the Blue Ridge Parkway and spent the day hiking trails I'd been meaning to explore. The mountains were beautiful in the summer heat, and I met several other hikers who were friendly and welcoming. One couple, probably in their 70s, invited me to join their weekly hiking group. When I returned home that evening, there was a car I didn't recognize parked in front of Mrs. Coleman's house. Through her kitchen window, I could see her talking with a younger man whose posture reminded me painfully of Albert. I parked in my own driveway and sat there for several minutes, gathering my courage. Then I got out of my car and walked directly to my front door with looking toward Mrs. Coleman's house. Inside, I made myself a simple dinner and tried to read, but I kept glancing toward the window. Around 8:00, there was a soft knock on my door. I opened it to find Albert standing on my porch, looking older and more tired than I remembered. His clothes were wrinkled, and he had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. Albert's porch visit was harder than Sadie's lobby performance, because his pain was not entirely false. A manipulator's tears are easier to resist than a son's. He stood under my porch light looking like the boy who used to come home after losing baseball games, trying not to cry until I said something ordinary like, "Want a sandwich?" His apologies were specific enough to matter, and that made them dangerous in a different way. Specific remorse can open doors that general regret cannot. When he said he remembered the cleaning schedule, I saw the old kitchen. When he said he chose comfort over me, I heard the closest thing to truth he had offered in years. But I had learned that truth spoken once does not rebuild trust destroyed daily. So I did not invite him inside. The threshold protected both of us. He needed to know that one honest night did not erase 5 silent years. I needed to know that my compassion did not still own my feet. We stood there with the porch between past and future, and when he left, he did not ask for money, keys, or rescue. He only said, "I will write if that is allowed." I told him writing was allowed. Then I went inside, closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it for a long time, shaking. "Hi, Dad," he said quietly. We stood there looking at each other for a long moment. This was my son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle, and helped with homework, and worried about through every stage of his life. But he was also the man who'd stood by while his wife treated me like hired help in my own home. "You look good," he said, finally. "Healthy?" "I am healthy. Mrs. Coleman seems nice. She told me you've been helping at the community center." I nodded, not making this easy for him. Albert's composure cracked slightly. "Dad, I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but I needed to say it to your face. I'm sorry for everything I know you are. Sadie told me what she said to you yesterday about being a lonely old widower. That was cruel and wrong." "Yes, it was." He shifted his weight, clearly struggling with what to say next. "I lost my job. I know. You probably think it serves me right." I studied his face, seeing the boy he'd been underneath the worried lines and stubble. "I don't think you deserve to suffer, Albert, but I also don't think you're suffering is my responsibility to fix." His eyes filled with tears. "I know I don't have the right to ask, but I need help, not money," he added quickly, seeing my expression. "Just guidance. I don't know how to be a man without you, and I'm afraid I've forgotten how to be your son." It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years, and it broke my heart a little, but it also strengthened my resolve. "You learned how to be a man without me when you chose your wife's comfort over your father's dignity," I said gently. "You can learn how to solve your problems the same way." Albert's shoulders sagged. "So that's it, we're done." I looked at my son, this man I'd loved and sacrificed for and been disappointed by, and I felt something settle into place inside me. "We're done being the kind of family we were," I said. "Whether we become something different is up to you." Time did what time does. It did not forgive. It revealed. Albert's letters changed slowly. The early ones were wet with regret, heavy with phrases people use when they want pain to move faster. "I am so sorry. I understand now. Please believe me." Later, the letters became plainer. "I applied for 3 jobs. I cooked dinner and burned it. I found one of Mom's old recipes and could not read her handwriting without crying. I saw a man at the grocery store buying soup and thought of the cans Sadie told you to eat." The less he asked from me, the more I trusted the words. Sadie's messages, when they slipped through blocked numbers or arrived through relatives, changed in the opposite direction. First she was offended, then betrayed, then frightened, then righteous, never responsible. That distinction became my weather vane. A person who regrets harm becomes quieter and more specific. A person who regrets consequences becomes louder and more theatrical. 1 year later, I was sitting on my porch on a crisp October morning, watching the mountains blaze with fall colors when Mrs. Coleman walked over with a cup of coffee, and her usual warm smile. "Mail came early today," she said, settling into the rocking chair I'd bought for visitors. "Looks like you got something from Oregon." Patricia had been true to her word about staying in touch. We developed a routine of weekly phone calls and monthly letters, the kind of family relationship I'd forgotten was possible. She was planning to visit for Thanksgiving, our first holiday together in over a decade. "How's the hiking group treating you?" Mrs. Coleman asked. "Good," I said, and meant it. The Tuesday morning hikers had become genuine friends, people who valued my company for who I was rather than what I could do for them. "We're planning a trip to the Smokies next month." "That's wonderful. You seem so much happier than when you first arrived." She was right. I'd lost 20 pounds without trying, mostly because I was active and eating meals I actually enjoyed rather than forcing down food. While listening to complaints about my cooking, my blood pressure had improved enough that Dr. Martinez had reduced my medication. When I'd visited him during a trip back to handle some business, Edward, Mrs. Coleman said carefully, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you heard from your son late?" I had, though not in the way she probably expected. 2 months ago, I'd received a wedding invitation in the mail. Albert was getting remarried, this time to a woman named Jennifer, whom I'd never met. The invitation was formal and impersonal, addressed to Mr. Edward Holloway, as if I were a distant relative rather than the groom's father. I'd see a wedding gift, a nice set of kitchen knives with a card that read, "Wishing you happiness." I never heard back. "He's doing well," I told Mrs. Coleman truthfully. "He found a new job and remarried." "But you weren't at the wedding?" "No, I wasn't invited in any meaningful way." Mrs. Coleman nodded knowingly. She'd raised 4 children of her own and understood family dynamics better than most. Sometimes the hardest part of loving someone is accepting that they're not capable of loving you back the way you deserve, she said gently. That afternoon, I drove into town for my weekly grocery shopping. The routine had become one of my favorite parts of the week. I shopped at a small market where the FF knew my name and preferences, where I could take my time choosing fresh vegetables and good cuts of meat, without anyone complaining about the cost or questioning my choices. As I was loading groceries into my car, my phone rang. The number was familiar, but blocked, which meant it was probably Albert calling from work. I'd never blocked his voice number, though I rarely answered it. This time something made me pick up. Dad. Albert's voice was tentative, uncertain. "Hello, Albert. I got married last weekend." "I know, congratulations." A long pause. "I wasn't sure if you'd gotten the invitation. I mean, I wasn't sure if you'd want to come." "I wouldn't have," I said honestly, "but I hope you're happy." "Why?" Another pause. "Jennifer's pregnant." The words hit me with unexpected force. I was going to be a grandfather again, or rather I already was a grandfather. But this would be the first grandchild born since I'd chosen my own life over theirs. "That's wonderful news," I said. "And I meant it, Dad. I know things between us are complicated, but I want this baby to know their grandfather. Jennifer doesn't understand why we don't talk, and I'm tired of making excuses." I leaned against my car, watching other shoppers go about their daily lives, while I processed this unexpected conversation. "What does Sadie think about that?" I asked. "Sadie and I got divorced 6 months ago." Albert's voice was flat. "Matt. Or a fact, she moved back to Sacramento to live with her parents." I felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that Albert had finally seen through Sadie's manipulation, sadness that he'd had to learn such a painful lesson, and something that might have been vindication, though I tried to push that feeling aside. "I'm sorry your marriage didn't work out." "I'm not," Albert said quietly. "Dad, I know I can't undo the past 5 years. I know I hurt you in ways that probably can't be forgiven, but I'm trying to be a better man now, and I'd like the chance to be a better son." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his words. This was the conversation I'd imagined having dozens of times, the apology I'd dreamed of receiving, but now that it was happening, I found myself approaching it with caution rather than relief. "What does that look like to you, Albert, being a better son?" "I don't know yet," admitted. "Maybe we could start with phone calls. Maybe I could visit sometime, just me, and we could talk. Maybe you could meet Jennifer and the baby when they're born, and if I'm not ready for that, then I'll wait until you are, or I'll accept that you never will be." "Dad, I'm not calling to pressure you or guilt you into anything. I just wanted you to know that I understand now why you left, and I don't blame you for it." It was the conversation I'd needed to have with him a year ago, but hearing it now felt different than I'd expected. Instead of relief or joy, I felt a calm certainty about my own boundaries. "I'm glad you've learned from your mistakes," I said, "and I'm glad you're starting fresh with someone who treats you better. But Albert, I need you to understand something. I don't need your apology to be happy anymore." "I know," he said. "I'm not apologizing to get you back. I'm apologizing because it's true, and because I should have said it years ago. That distinction meant more to me than he probably realized." "The baby will be born in April," Albert continued. "If you'd like to meet them, you're welcome anytime. If not, I understand that too." After we hung up, I sat in my car for several minutes thinking about grandchildren and second chances, and the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. I thought about Margaret, and how she would have handled this situation, how she would have balanced her love for Albert with her respect for my dignity. That evening I called Patricia and told her about Albert's call. "Are you going to see the baby?" she asked. "I'm thinking about it. Maybe when they're older, when I can visit without it being about Albert's guilt or Jennifer's curiosity about the estranged grandfather." "That sounds wise. You don't owe anyone a relationship on their timeline." Margaret rose, complicated the landscape of my heart. "Babies should not be born into old wars, yet families hand them maps stained before they can speak." When I saw her photograph, tiny fist tucked under her chin, I felt love without history, and that frightened me because love without history is pure enough to tempt foolishness. I wanted to drive to Albert's house, hold her, smell the milk sweetness of her hair, Tell her about the grandmother whose name she carried. I also knew that babies become bridges people try to cross before the river is safe, so I opened the savings account instead. Each month I deposited a little money and wrote nothing. It was love with a locked gate. It was care without surrender. Perhaps one day she will know. Perhaps she will not. Not every act of love needs applause, and I have learned to distrust love that arrives with an invoice. 6 months later, I received photos in the mail, a beautiful baby girl named Margaret Rose. After her late grandmother, in the photos, Albert looked tired, but genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen since before his first marriage. I studied the pictures for a long time. This granddaughter who shared my late wife's name, she had Albert's chin and what looked like my own eyes, though it was hard to tell with babies. I put the photos in a frame on my kitchen table where I could see them during my morning coffee. But I didn't call Albert to thank him for sending them. I wasn't ready for that level of connection yet, and I learned that being ready was a requirement I was allowed to have. Instead, I opened a savings account at the local bank and began making monthly deposits. When Margaret Rose was old enough to need college funding or a car or help with a first apartment, the money would be there. But it would come with no strings attached, no expectations of gratitude or relationship. Just the quiet love of a grandfather who'd earned the difference between helping and enabling. On my 60th birthday, I threw myself a small party. Mustache Coleman came along with 3 couples from my hiking group and 2 women from the community center where I still volunteered. We ate cake on my porch and watched the sunset over the mountains, and nobody mentioned anything I should be doing differently or anyone I should be including who wasn't there that night. As I was cleaning up the dishes, I realized something that would have shocked the man I'd been 2 years ago. I was genuinely happy, not the conditional happiness that depended on other people's approval or the absence of conflict, but the deep, quiet satisfaction that comes from living according to your own values. I thought about the letter I'd left on that kitchen table so long ago, about the scared and angry man who'd written it while his family celebrated without him. That man had been breaking apart, but he'd had the courage to put himself back together differently. I still miss Margaret every day, but I'd learned to carry that grief alongside joy rather than letting it define my entire existence. I still loved Albert, but I'd learned that loving someone doesn't mean accepting their poor treatment. I still had moments of loneliness, but I discovered the difference between being alone and being lonely. My phone was on the counter, and I would see that I had a voicemail from an unknown number. It might have been Albert calling from somewhere new. It might have been Sadie trying one more manipulation. It might have been a telemarketer. I deleted it. Without listening. Tomorrow, I would wake up in my own home, make my own breakfast, and spend my day doing things that brought me satisfaction and peace. I would volunteer at the community center, tend my small garden, maybe drive up to the mountains for a hike in the evening. I might call Patricia, or read a book, or simply sit on my porch and watch the world go by. It was a quiet life, a simple life, but it was entirely mine. And after 65 years of trying to be the man everyone else needed me to be, that felt like the greatest victory of all. Now, when evening settles over Asheville and the porch boards cool under my feet, I sometimes speak to Margaret as if she is sitting in the empty chair beside me. I tell her Albert is trying. I tell her Sadie is gone from my daily life, though not from memory. I tell her Patricia still says exactly what she thinks. I tell her the tomatoes failed, but the basil survived. I tell her I kept her recipe cards. Sometimes I apologize for letting our house become a place where her husband was diminished. Sometimes I imagine her answer not soft, because Margaret was never soft when truth was required. She would say, "Edward, you stayed too long." Then she would take my hand, because she would also know why. That is the mercy I allow myself, not the fantasy that she would approve of everything, but the belief that she would understand the long path between endurance and escape. Standing there in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a birthday celebration, where everyone who attended genuinely wanted to be there, I finally understood what Margaret had been trying to tell me in those last difficult months of her illness. Edward, you deserve to be loved for who you are, not for what you can do for other people. It had taken me 2 years and a new life to really hear those words, but I was listening now, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, that was enough. The truth I live with now is colder than triumph. People hear that I sold the house, moved to Asheville, found friends, built a quiet life, and they want to call it victory because victory makes pain easier to consume. But the real shape of it is heavier. I did not win back the years when I ate alone while my son laughed in another room. I did not recover the evenings when I cleaned a kitchen I owned while Sadie slept in the master bedroom. where Margaret once folded laundry and hummed old songs. I did not become the man I would have been if I had drawn a line the first time my daughter-in-law spoke to me like staff, and my son pretended not to hear. Boundaries can save the future, but they do not refund the past. That is the part no one likes to say. I survived, yes. I found peace, yes. I built mornings that belonged to me. But some losses remain seated at the table, even after the guests leave. When I look at Albert's letters, I feel love and distance in the same breath. When I look at Margaret Rose's photographs, I feel tenderness and caution holding hands. When I pass a restaurant window and see families raising glasses, I sometimes feel the old kitchen under my feet, the plastic container in my hand, the word family being used as a locked door. I do not collapse under those memories anymore, but I do not pretend they have become harmless. They are part of the architecture now. They hold up warnings. They hold up wisdom. They hold up the small daily discipline of not returning to a place just because someone finally misses the work you used to do there. If Albert and I become close again one day, it will not be because blood demanded it. It will be because he spends years becoming a man who understands that love is not proven by apologies after comfort disappears. If I meet Margaret Rose and she calls me grandpa, I will answer with my whole heart, but I will not hand that heart back to the adults who once used it as collateral. If Sadie ever regrets what she did, I will not be there to witness it. Some lessons belong only to the person who refused to learn them in time. Tonight the cottage is quiet. The dishes are washed. The porch light is on because I like the way it looks against the dark. There is no labeled container in my refrigerator. There is soup in a pot, a book open on the table, and a photograph of Margaret on the windowsill. Outside, the mountains are black against the last blue of evening. Unmoving, indifferent, steady. I used to think peace would feel warm. Sometimes it does. More often it feels like a locked door between me and the life that nearly consumed me. I keep that door locked. I sleep better that way. And in the morning, when the light comes over the ridges and fills my kitchen without asking permission from anyone, I make coffee for myself, sit where I choose, and let the silence remain silent. Not punishment, not loneliness, not waiting. Mind.